Good morning. This is Richard Cheng from the Sativa Segment, episode 24. Today, I'm very excited about talking to our guest, Cliff Porter. But before we get started, I'd like to say that this episode is fueled by Ritter Spencer Cheng. It's a full-service law firm based in Addison, Texas. I'm one of the owners. We have a broad array of services at the firm, ranging from corporate M&A to healthcare to advising on regulatory advice in the alternative substances world to real estate and labor employment. If you want to know a little bit more about the firm, go to ritterspencercheng.com. Cliff, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Great to be here.
Yeah, we've known each other for a while. Mm-hmm. We're going to talk about some really exciting stuff that's hyper technical. Right, certainly beyond my cerebral capacity, but you're the guy to talk to. How do we meet? We met several years ago, didn't we?
We did. I think it was in 2016.
Okay.
I'm a forensic accountant by trade, and Richard, being an attorney, was working at a firm where we had a mutual client on what's commonly known in the Dallas area as one of the largest white collar crime matters in Dallas. 27
at the time.
Yeah. Right. Yeah, 27 indicted people, if I remember the number right.
God, wasn't that crazy? Yeah. There were 21 people that were indicted in that case.
Yeah, it was the Forest Park Medical Center trial, and some very, very high profile doctors and healthcare practitioners across Dallas and really across Texas that were indicted on it.
Yeah, so that case was just crazy. I mean, there were so many doctors that were indicted. Our client, he was one of the 12 that didn't take a plea, right? But I don't know if I ever told you this, but I was actually connected to two other people that were indicted in that case.
Nice.
One of them was a long-term client of mine. Now, he got involved with that case long before he and I started doing work together. And there was another individual who came to me for advice. He didn't tell me what it was, but I advised against it, and he went. I think that based on my understanding is that he kind of shopped around for some other attorneys. He finally found one that kind of blessed it.
Got it.
And he got involved. But that was a crazy case, man. I think over $200 million were in dispute.
Yeah.
And I think the indictment was like 43 pages or something
right.
like that.
Yeah, it was. The premise of it was a healthcare kickback scheme. So the allegations, which I guess proven now since a lot of them were found guilty, was that doctors were taking bribes in order to perform their surgeries, and mostly bariatric and spine surgeons that were the ones involved for them to do the surgeries on their patients at Forest Park, which was I actually had a back surgery there back in 2013. I can verify it was a nice facility, but not knowing what was going on there at the time.
Yeah, no, that was an interesting case to work on. So you and I actually met through that case. Mm-hmm. You were the forensic accountant on that case. I was one of the attorneys that was representing our client, who got indicted and then obviously got convicted. Of course, then again, to be fair, let's be honest, pretty much everybody got convicted on that case, with the exception of one, right?
One surgeon
he got acquitted.
Was acquitted.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. It was, I can't remember the quantity. There was two nurses, I guess, involved, or I forgot exactly what there were, but there were 9 total defendants that went to trial. So remember, there were 27 that were indicted. So, quick math.
I thought there were 21, but maybe you're
whatever
right.
the number was. But yeah, it was a large number, probably could have been more, from what they were saying. And so then 8 of the defendants actually 7 of the defendants that went to trial were found guilty. 1 had a hung jury, and then 1 was acquitted. Yeah. And remember the exact reason. But it was pretty high profile. The interesting part, one of the defendants had the same attorney that was over Michael Jackson, Bill Cosby, and so on. And I actually got to I sat through about a third of that trial. So it was kind of fun. And I was in the same group that would go to the same lunchroom each day during breaks. And Michael Jackson's attorney was one of the people in the room. It was on the same time the Netflix episode talking about Michael Jackson and all that was coming out, sort of anti him, and hear his takes on it. So yeah, it was kind of a fun experience. And for me, it was actually my first trial to testify at. So talk about trial by fire. You had every attorney really across the US, maybe world, but definitely across Dallas that was watching that. There were something like 40 or 50 attorneys in the room during when I was testifying or throughout the whole trial. And then they had a whole other courtroom at the same courthouse where it was filled with journalists and other things listening in. So I was the final witness of the trial. I think it lasted 8 weeks total, including deliberation by the jury. So
that must have been exhausting, right? I mean, that took a lot of time. I certainly spent a lot of time on that case. So forensic accounting, how did you get into forensic accounting and why forensic accounting?
Yeah, interesting. So I went to Texas A&M to get my accounting degree and then a graduate degree in finance. And as part of the program at Texas A&M, you can do an internship. And my wife and I both actually were in this accounting program there and went to Anderson. If you remember the Anderson accounting firm that, gosh, I guess now that was 23 years ago, but we were interning there right as the Enron chaos came. And it wasn't just Enron that caused the collapse of Anderson. It was WorldCom as well, but two major worldwide frauds that had occurred and kind of got my brain ticking like, fraud's kind of exciting. In the world of accounting, you have audit, which is, the broad confirming that audit financial statements for public companies are correct or whatever's required for banks and so on. Then you have tax, you have inside accounting teams for corporations and so on. And I got really interested in fraud and forensic accounting because of those situations. And obviously Anderson collapsed in 2002 or so. And then right after college, I started with KPMG, which was another big four firm, and had started to put forward to the forensics group there that, one day if there's ever a need, I'd like to have a chance to come over there. And I think it was about 2 years I did audit work for KPMG, mostly in the technology and software space, which kind of ties in a similarity of why I started getting involved with cannabis. There's similarities in terms of the startups and things like that. That's kind of fast forwarding in my career a bit. But where I got into forensic accounting, and it's actually the person that I'm still working with today at Fox Forensic was who hired me. He was a partner at KPMG Forensics way back when, so 20 years ago. At KPMG, hired me from the audit group to come into the forensic accounting group, and it was kind of an interesting reason why at the time. So you're talking about 20 whatever years ago now, when this started up. My background growing up had some computer programming involved. I did that in high school, took classes in college and so on, but still went down the accounting route. And that you wouldn't think those two things combined, but right when that timing around 2004 or so, they had a need for somebody to come in and help develop a product that analyzed digital transactions, financial transactions, so bank record, general ledgers, and so on at companies to assist the audit teams. And they needed someone that was a CPA, which I'm a CPA, and also had audit experience to come help with that. And that sort of helped me, build my presence within the forensic space as well, to the point where after a few years, I even traveled or moved to Australia for 3 years with in my career. My wife and I both were working at KPMG, so transferred there, and that was all because of my background of building more of a technology element to investigations of financial records. And but yeah, that was kind of my entrance to it.
So pretty highly specialized area of accounting. It's very, very niche-y in type. It's not tax, it's not audit. It's something very different. How are you getting how do you get involved, or in terms of getting work in forensic accounting, and more specifically, how are you developing your networks within the forensic accounting world?
Yeah, sure. So if I were to, take a pie here, probably about 70% of the work comes through attorneys of some sort. That's litigation attorneys, criminal defense attorneys, family law attorneys, mergers and acquisitions. It's fairly broad. Healthcare attorneys, like with Richard and so on, things like that, where there's already something that's occurred that requires somebody, a forensic accountant, to come in. And there's, in the litigation space, for example, they need somebody to come in and calculate what the damage to the other to one of the parties is for the actions, unlawful actions by the other party. So there's this economic damage component that a lot of time has a fraud component, whether it's a breach of fiduciary duty or tortious interference, things like that, where it does have a fraud angle to it, but really it's economic damages in the end. Somebody suffered, and it could be, based on their actions, they may have only taken some sum of money, but it caused the whole company to be destroyed. Yeah. Well, what was the cost to the damaged party, right? So usually there's some form of an attorney that's already involved in that process. The other part of it is financial fraud investigations, and that's can come from anything from C-suite executives to board members to auditors, where they're the ones that catch something, need someone to come in and look at it, or also, again, litigation attorneys and other types of attorneys as well. And that's kind of how the forensic accounting world is split up. And you could put white collar crime or criminal defense kind of fits in that litigation space because it's something court related. Financial fraud investigations would be where it's at the onset of suspected fraud, or you already know there's fraud. Someone needs to come in and quantify it, figure out how the fraud was perpetrated, and then work with law enforcement, work with insurance, work with the company and the board to resolve, kind of make the issues not happen again in the future and resolve the current issues as well.
So with all that said, how did you transition that forensic expertise or that focus on forensic accounting into the cannabis world? And are you seeing a lot of a need for forensic accounting in cannabis?
Yeah, the move into it actually was sort of kind of somewhat just based on personal interest, knowing Richard as well and hearing him talk about the cannabis space when he started moving predominantly into it. But really it was, I kind of hopped firms a little bit. I went internal as the global investigations lead for a large company for a while. And then when I came back, I kind of firm hopped a little bit before stationing here at Fox. And one of the firms in the middle was Armanino, which is a California law firm, accounting firm.
Yeah, they have a pretty, a pretty substantial cannabis practice, don't they?
They do, and this gets into the kind of the stigma component of cannabis, and as it impacts law firms, just as it does accounting firms. And there aren't many accounting firms that will touch the cannabis space. And I know Richard and I've talked about, quite a bit. That's the same in the law space, and kind of causes people to jump a little bit if they feel like they have a niche there and they know people. Well, some firms won't accept the work. So when I was at Armanino, I was interested right when I joined there that they had a specialty cannabis accounting advisory and audit, where they would work with cannabis companies. So, and just I got to know some of the team members there, and would hear internal presentations and read the internal communications on it and so on. It just kind of sparked interest, and then over time we would start seeing the forensic accounting group there, which I'm part of, or was part of. Start seeing investigations that some of their clients come over, so we would help with those, and it just kind of got me thinking. It was just it's an exciting industry, right? Because you think about it as, manufacturing, healthcare, like with insurance type stuff, and construction, so on. I mean, trust me, I have some pretty cool stories.
I mean, listen, what better than to, tie in fraud, kind of a sexy topic with a highly stigmatized industry, right? And you combine the two, and you're quite honestly, I mean, I've seen quite a bit of fraud in the industry myself. I know you and I have co-presented at a few conferences and online. I was at NOCO earlier this year in Colorado and did a pretty big presentation at a national conference on fraud and abuse in the cannabis industry.
Right.
So we've talked about this topic on an ongoing basis. What do you, as a forensic accountant, what do you consider is defined as really fraud for the audience? Yeah,
sure. There's a lot of categories, and I know a lot of what we're planning to talk about today is around investor fraud, Ponzi schemes, pump and dump schemes, and so on. And that's one element of where an entity itself or an investment company are scamming investors. But then a lot of what we're seeing outside of those is the internal fraud at companies. And that gets into whether there's some kind of employee fraud where there's embezzlement of some sort in the company, fake employees, whatever other way, any way that an employee can try to drive money out. There's vendor fraud, which could be collusion with an employee or a vendor taking advantage in some way.
Money laundering.
Money laundering, especially because in cannabis, it is by kind of nature, the fact that there's banking regulation issues, legality issues is cash heavy, right? And so you do get into a lot of money laundering.
Well, honestly, there's also a product fraud, right? Misrepresentation of the products and what it does and doesn't do, the composition of the product. But to your point, I do want to get to the investment side. That's, to me, that's kind of an interesting topic. And I think it's a topic that doesn't get talked about enough in the cannabis industry, despite the fact that it actually happens more often than people think. So we've covered fraud, and there's obviously different categories of fraud. Is there any one type of fraud that you've personally dealt with or you've seen that's more prevalent out of all the different types of fraud that we've already talked about on a personal, I guess, through your work? Yeah,
I mean, through my work, I do a lot of white collar crime, criminal defense space. So I work a lot in the Ponzi scheme type area. I have a lot of clients, and fortunately a lot of them in
But
prison.
Are these in cannabis though?
Not in cannabis.
Okay, so
in general, right? A lot of Ponzi matters. And when you Google cannabis industry fraud, the things you are going to see are going to be the pump and dump schemes, the Ponzi schemes. Those are kind of the sexier topics, big dollar amounts, and interesting ways people spent their money, or and so on, which I'm sure we'll probably talk about one of those. In the cannabis industry, though, I mean, it's very much embezzlement. And if I were to say what's the common theme of what I've seen at these companies, and in the fraud industry, the accounting world, there's a phrase we say: trust is the worst control, right? And it's unfortunate. It's over and over and over again. I'm just working a big matter right now that I can't talk about because it's active, but it was simply, there was just too much trust put into the CFO and embezzled money, right? And that's not a cannabis one, but what we've seen in the past in the cannabis world is really that. And it's kind of we've had a couple presentations we've done together with other organizations. And I remember I don't remember the exact titles of them, but one was From the Basement to the High Rise, and the other had something to do alluding to the Wild West. And I always look at it in the cannabis industry as very much so like the Gold Rush or the Wild West, where there's so much of this legality changes. It's obviously unique state by state, and it's not just opening just once and then it's free. It could be medical first. It could be then it's recreational next. And every single time there's this legality change, it opens up the doors for this mass rush of new companies coming in, wanting to capitalize on that, between growers and distribution, testing facilities, and so on, right? And if it's brand new to a state, you may have a bunch of people, and this was kind of the concept of the basement to the high rise topic. It's not to down on the industry, but at the time when it first started to get legalized, I mean, you had basically hobbyists, right, that were jumping up. I mean, of course, we saw the same thing in beer brewing. I mean, you see that a lot. Where
so is it a fair statement that depending on the regulatory changes and the regulatory framework evolutions, depending on how it changes and how it evolves, that dictates the capital injections and the flow of cash in and out of the industry?
Absolutely. And that's
which as you said, it could trigger the potential embezzlement or potential fraud that's associated with that.
And on top of that growth, when you look at on a per state basis with each wave of legalization, you look at that revenue year on year is extreme for the first 3 or 4 years, which is kind of common sense. It went from literally zero to it's there. So, but what happens is, and this is true in any growth industry, and earlier I kind of alluded to that, my background, heavy background in technology and software, you have so many startups. And what happens is growth is these companies are growing at such an extreme rate, they don't necessarily think to take a step back and say, hey, hold on, what accounting controls, processes, and procedures do we have in place to make sure that our systems can even, track all these records here, these transactions, but that no one is taking advantage of us. And what ends up happening in a lot of these situations is the trust is the worst control comes in, and they say, all right, let's just concentrate on continuing to grow. We want to stay ahead in case we want to ultimately sell to a big fish, or we want to become a big fish. And someone sees that as an opportunity to capitalize on. Nobody's really, there's no watchdogs and controls, and then take advantage of it. And, maybe some skate through and it's fine. And they get through and they look back 3 years later and they go, oh, yeah, okay, I was defrauded $1 million, but hey, I'm worth 100 million now, so who cares? But it doesn't always work that way. It could cause the complete destruction of the company. But yeah, that's where you start getting these fake vendors that are set up. And that's a big one, because one of the best controls to combat vendor fraud is that you have background checks you can do into companies. And that's always what I say to companies, like, what do you do when you have a new vendor that comes in? Do you do, background checks on them? Do you go look to see if they have a website? How long has the company been incorporated? Do you do all that? And a lot of people go, no, we make sure there's an invoice and someone's vouching for the vendor because they're the one that is buying their product, right? But ultimately, you don't have these controls in place to a big extent when it's a new industry. You have this wave of new companies. There's not really a lot of public information available to the to the buyer to say, is this a real entity or not? You just see, Cannabis Inc. Well, that sounds real.
Yeah, and what I've seen is being that it's an industry that's somewhat fragmented, and everybody kind of got into it at different levels, different stages. You have a lot of these startup companies that need cash, right? And many are legitimate, many are less legitimate, and maybe some of them are legitimate and they just simply don't know what they're doing, and they become illegitimate or less legitimate later on because they start off with all the good intents, and then you need cash because now you're cash poor. So, take the 2021 Canna Pharma capital raising situation. My understanding with that one was they raised $14 million, and they didn't really do anything with it. Yeah. They just kind of the investors gave, they aggregated money for about 14 million, and the people who were seeking capital investments, they just took the money and used it on themselves. Yeah. How often do you see that happening?
Yeah, and that's pretty common. And what Richard's alluding to there with the kind of the background of that particular matter, it's a common theme in all Ponzi schemes in general. And it comes down to, and I'll tell you from my experience, and this ties directly into it, from having a lot of white collar crime clients that were accused of indicted and finally actually found guilty for the Ponzi schemes. And it gets a little more technical than just Ponzi scheme when it comes down to the counts. But ultimately, even when the attorneys would talk to the jury after, they would say, okay, hey, when was it that you were decided on this? It always comes down to one central point that's key to Ponzi schemes and pump and dump schemes, and that's representations made, right? So in that particular situation is kind of one of the perfect examples of a Ponzi scheme, right? Where you needed this cash infusion for whatever it is to pay off old investors or whatever it is, but you lied about how the money was going to be used. You lied about how your company is already generating revenue and profitability, what assets you have. And so as an investor, and this is why it's securities fraud, when you make a misrepresentation like that to try to raise money, is because you as an investor have the right, when you are deciding who to give your money to really understand all the risks associated with how the return you're going to end up getting. And if someone's telling you, hey, the last 24 months we've been profitable, right? Something like that. I mean, that sounds pretty good.
It's money there. With my experience in the industry is that most of the misrepresentations and the I would say, either covering up information, they're either covering up potential liabilities, or they're covering up potential investigations that's in existing or pending.
Right.
But or they're inflating their financials or inflating the quality and the sales the sales frequency of their products.
Right.
Sometimes they'll even lie about products that they're not even making, but they say, well, it's available, but it's really not, and they've only simply talked about it.
Yeah.
So I actually have a story. I think I've told you. I was actually caught up in a fraud situation where I was the investor.
Yeah.
And I cut a check for an investment for, one of those escape rooms. I don't know if you've ever been to one.
Oh, yeah,
but
many times.
This individual in the DFW area, who will remain nameless at this time, said that they're raising money, and they needed to raise a certain amount, and I was one of the investors. And the pitch was, we're going to open up this really grand escape room here because I already have one at this other location. So I cut a check, and I never saw that escape room being developed. I think there was some construction, and I swear to this day, I don't know for a fact. I swear he coordinated the construction to make it look like something was being built.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
And long story short, I got my money back, but that was only after I had made several very aggressive moves, making legal demands and legal threats to the individual, along with making some very other aggressive assertions involving PR and, providing information to the government. At that point, he returned the money.
Right.
So, that really shouldn't be the case for most investors, because when you're an investor, you should be given, a private placement memorandum, a PPM, that describes all the risks, that tells you that you should be an accredited investor, what's defined as an accredited investor. The subscription agreement should define what you're subscribing into. You should go through the whole subscription questionnaire. If you're not properly positioned in life as an investor, you shouldn't be investing. That's first and foremost, right? And then secondarily, the proper disclosures that should be given to you on what the prospective investment is. They should define the fact that it's high risk, and that there's no guarantee that you're going to get your money back, and that this is what you're investing into. The problem I see with the cannabis industry is that disclosure isn't always accurate, one, and then two, the scope of the disclosure is somewhat limited.
Right.
Has that been your experience too, or?
Yeah, I mean, it's the representations that really we end up seeing. I mean, I actually similar to you in a situation where it's a same thing, invested into something, and it seemed that there were true representations to it, but remember filing all those forms and all that. Yeah. I'm trying to think in the cannabis industry how that might be a little different, other than you might be getting investors that are just really interested in it, and they might be a little bit more susceptible to, they haven't done a lot of investments into startup companies, IPOs or penny stocks, whatever it is in the past, and they're kind of new to it, and they don't necessarily know the right questions to ask or to expect in the investment packages, or maybe that's the target by the fraudster to say, hey, this is the type of person I want to go after, someone who's not going to ask me questions about certain financial ratios and proof of stuff and things like that to get their money. I think that's really more of where the susceptible, can't pronounce the word, of the investors might be maybe more targeted in that kind of situation.
And also, let's be honest. I mean, a lot of the smaller cannabis investments, you're looking at initial seed money from friends and family, right? And the friends and family, many times they're not investing in the product or the company. They're really investing in you, because they believe in you,
right?
And so when your investment approach and what you're actually investing into, that could also alter the lens perspective on what I'm actually investing into. So at that point, they can really kind of tell the friends and family anything they want.
Yeah, right? and that's where, it's actually not even like this stuff in writing. On a lot of time, with Ponzi schemes where I'm on the criminal defense side, there's like one sheet promissory notes, right? Okay, the promissory note says stuff that may or may not was happening, doesn't really matter. It's really the other stuff, and it can be written or verbal, right? You get enough witnesses up there saying, I was told verbally the money is going to be used for X purpose. That's that's part of the representations that were made. But a lot of time it's in flyers and, other types of pamphlets that an investor's putting out there saying, hey, why should you put your money here? And you'll start, seeing things. I had one not too long ago where the person was saying, I went to I forgot which high profile school, Harvard Business School or something like that. And we never actually went there. It could be something as little as that, where the representation.
Well, it's a form of inducement, right? You're inducing a third party to give you money based off of your level of credibility.
Right.
Or based off of the level of representation that you're providing them.
Yes.
Because now there's a sense of belief in that investment.
Right.
Right. And so that's the misrepresentation part.
Yeah.
So let's transition a little bit about talking about two really high level concepts of fraud that's common in the cannabis industry. One of them is the pump and dump schemes.
Yes.
The second are Ponzi schemes, which they're two very different forms of fraud.
Right.
My understanding with pump and dumps, which is when individuals or companies are seeking investors or seeking investment money, they essentially drive up the price of the stock, because it has to start somewhere, right? The more money you receive, and then of course the value of the company goes up, the valuation goes up. They, at some point, they pump up the value of the company and the overall value per unit for the company, and then at its height they dump it. Hence the word pump and dump, right? So they dump it at its peak, and then shortly after that, the value of the stock just plummets.
Right.
And so everyone else who's given money is,
they're the ones taking the loss.
Right. They're the one that's left holding the bag.
Yeah.
And the people who are seeking the initial money, they're off into the sunset because their initial seed money was pennies on the dollar. Now they sold it and they walk away with a lot of profit. So
and that's the famous one. Actually, if you go into Google,
Eugenics, right?
Well, the American premium water, I believe.
Okay.
Might be mixing the three words up there, but that was one that was a true pump and dump type situation where there was a stock promoter that, by the way, wasn't disclosed. Stock promoters are supposed to be disclosed to the SEC and things like that, but wasn't in this case, where it was actually the stock promoter was affiliated with the company.
Okay.
I think it was a $10 million raise of capital of some sort, but this stock promoter was out on social media and other ways to just really oversell this entity as an independent, supposed to be independent in what they're preaching, but really wasn't, no foundation to it. And I don't remember if that one that was probably a 2023 one, right?
Well, did I get Eugenics mixed up with a Ponzi scheme?
Eugenics is a true Ponzi scheme.
Yeah.
A pump and dump is like the American.
So tell me what the difference is. So I guess tell the audience the difference between a pump and dump and a Ponzi, because we've talked about pump and dumps, and I kind of defined it in a very rudimentary way. But what is a true Ponzi scheme, though? Yeah,
so Ponzi schemes versus pump and dump schemes, they both have the same central starting point, which is the misrepresentations that were made.
That's the commonality.
The commonality there is that, through some form of inducement, right, to get people's money. I kind of look at it as somewhat of a longer term scheme versus shorter term scheme. Ponzi schemes tend to be the longer term schemes. If you think about some of the famous ones like Bernie Madoff or Stafford and so on, you're talking about billions and billions of dollars, where the premise of a Ponzi scheme, as we were kind of already talking about, is that you need people's money to keep the business going, but there really are no assets, revenue generating assets at the company. So in order to pay the sometimes or often lucrative returns that were promised to get the original investors money to pay their principal back or pay their monthly interest, dividends, so on, you need new money. Right. So you keep making misrepresentations to new investors to pay for that. But it's just this rolling scheme because there really isn't much or any. A true Ponzi scheme is where there is no actual business operations. It's named after a guy named Charles Ponzi back in the early 1900s. And I'm completely forgetting what it was that he was promoting, he was buying, but there was nothing there. He just took people's money and just created this scheme and lived in prosperity until he got caught, right? Now, what you often see now, if you actually read a criminal indictment, that's a Ponzi type thing. They actually use the phrase Ponzi-like. And that's a situation where there actually is business operations, just significantly less. I think the Bernie Madoff situation was actually a Ponzi-like because he was at like 10% of the assets actually existed and were earning, right? But
I think that's what WeGenix was, wasn't it? WeGenix involved Max Bergman and what is it, Big Baby Boy, where they raised like $16.5 million, but they didn't really know how to run a cannabis company.
Yeah, and they even on that one, when investors wanted a tour of their facility, they ended up giving a tour of a different facility that wasn't even their own. That one was a true Ponzi in that there were no business operations. And yeah, I just thought the funniest one there, and this goes back to a comment I made earlier. It's funny in my career. I'll see all kinds of the ways that people spent money. Can be any kind of fraud, but especially in Ponzi schemes, in just crazy ways. A lot of gambling losses. Of course, women, things like that, right? But in this one here, it was I forgot how much they had raised, but he had spent quite a bit of money on his side job as a rapper. It was Big Rig Baby, was his I guess rapper name to it. But yeah, that one there was no business operations, and eventually it unfolded. They got caught, and I remember what the circumstances of that was.
So let's talk about pump and dump a little bit. Well, I guess, can you elaborate at all beyond what I said about pump and dumps?
Yeah, well, you pretty much covered. I mean, the pump and dump, the concept there is I need to raise capital for whatever, whether it's raise the stock price so I can sell and get out, or also as a side of inducement of your Ponzi scheme. And I was talking to Richard not too long ago about that. Really, Ponzi schemes and pump and dump schemes can kind of coexist at the same time. It could be a Ponzi scheme for a while, and they need to show for it. A lot of the Ponzi schemes are, say, on the over-the-counter stock exchange, penny stocks, things like that, and they need to impress their investors to say, hey, the value of my company, this company is X. Look, it has a stock price of $30 on the over-the-counter stock exchange, right? And now we need to look at that, and then people give money because they say, oh yeah, this is the real deal. So it could be a temporary, just to cause to inflate it or not, but in order to raise it up, you have to have some form of publicity, and that's where you get the social media element and all.
Have you seen much pump and dump schemes in your career? During the last, we'll just say 10 years.
Yeah. I mean, the pump and dump, as far as what I've actually seen, either in criminal defense or investigations, I've only seen two of that type of a situation. I think there's always some kind of an allegation as part of a Ponzi scheme that they were inflating the value of the companies, which you could argue there is that element, but not. I haven't actually been involved where that's the sole situation. It's a pump and dump type of scheme. It's always been a minor or end point involved with a long time Ponzi matter, and those are the ones that
Yeah, I don't see a whole lot of that in cannabis, although, I think that, it does exist. I think it absolutely exists. I'm more on a private level as opposed to like an IPO where, they inflate their numbers. They for whatever reason, however way they get an altered valuation of their company. And they're able to drive up the numbers, and people invest, and then the existing operators, they just want out one day, right? That's almost like a pump and dump light version, right? Sure. But most of the ones that I've seen fall more consistent with like the Canna Pharma situation, where you raise money. We say we're going to do all this stuff with the money. They don't really do it, but in reality, they're using that money to buy cars, homes, luxury items, and they just kind of disappear. And now you're having to chase down the money. But it wasn't really like a true pump and dump. It wasn't really truly a Ponzi because they really weren't paying existing investors either. So.
Just taking the money and running. Yeah, again, I've seen some crazy ones in my time as far as what people spend all this money on. I mean, there was this one. It was a large one ages ago now, but it lived in Vegas, and you search through his emails, and there's just litters of lost statements from the casinos where one day he loses 250 grand, another day lost 100 grand. And it's just, it just depends on what they want to use it for. But yeah, those are the situations where, those are the ones that unfold quick. If they're truly spending that money on themselves in tremendous amounts, rather than paying back the old investors, at some point in time, it's going to fold. If they have a short period of time where they're not able to get new investors, they can't pay the interest rates. And, keep in mind, one element of that, one of the reasons that they are fairly successful at getting those new investors is the rates are insane of what they're often promising. Is, say, if it's a promissory note instead of just a true stock. I mean, some of these have, the WeGenix one was promising 36% returns. And that's
I think it was a range
high.
between like 17 to 36%, where it was like a guaranteed return, right? Just really kind of an off topic, but somewhat related. Because of interest rates and access to capital has been so limited, do you think, in your opinion, that the fraud schemes have slightly decreased because it's harder to get access to capital? Because I know, like, for example, in 2023, it was, and even second half of 2022, it was somewhat hard to get access to capital. It was not easy to get people or organizations that have traditionally invested in cannabis or alternative substances to actually take that leap of faith.
Right.
So I'm just wondering if because it's harder to get capital, if it's you see a decrease in investments, have the fraud schemes really kind of decreased?
It's funny you ask that in terms of the timing there, because a lot of the indictments and stuff like that are all 3, 4, 5 years old.
There you go.
So they end up taking a long time to eventually get to trial. So that'll be interesting to see if that starts to see that decline from ones that were in the last year or two.
So you'll find out in 2028, 2029.
I'll tell you all then.
Yeah,
but that's a good point.
So as we wrap up here, Cliff, what ways are you developing? Are you broadening your forensics practice? Are there different strategies that you're considering? I know that I think I got you involved with the INCBA, right?
Yep.
Getting you in contact with more attorneys that's involved with the cannabis industry. What are some strategies for you as you grow? Yeah,
sure. I mean, it's getting out there in front of those groups that do have a heavy, what we would consider, the buyers of forensic services, which would be, it's really the attorney's clients that are the buyers, but attorneys are that liaison there. And involvement with INCBA, with we're a sponsor of that organization now, and plans to at some point in time speak with that organization. But there's also an organization that the networking organization that's national, heavily in California.
But that's how else we're tied together.
Yeah,
so we're tied together in multiple levels.
Yeah, we follow each other around.
Yeah,
it's an organization called Provisors, and
that's true. Yeah,
I got involved right when COVID hit, which was kind of perfect timing, because
that's when you took me out to play golf and you were trying to like wrangle me in, and I was so resistant on that.
I tried for 3 years to get Richard to join this organization, and finally convinced him, and now he has
pretty active member now.
To it. Yeah. And one of the reasons that I was saying, hey, Richard, you have to come join this organization is, and first of all, Provisors, it's about 50% attorneys, 25% CPAs, and 25% other types of bankers, financial advisors, IT consultants, so on and so on. And but it's very attorney heavy in this organization. And in California, in the Northeast, where they have larger cannabis presences, they have these groups called affinity groups where where it gets together all these different people from all these different practices that are in the organization.
Have you been going to those? Or
I go to them occasionally.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. And it's just great because you get all kinds of different professions that are in there. Again, a lot of attorneys, but other professions as well. So business owners and stuff like that. But yeah, it's been like that. And then also I've been on the board and treasurer for the Dallas chapter of the ACFE, which is the Association of Certified Fraud Examiners, for many years now. I think 8 years or so. And
that's the conference we spoke
and Richard and I did a presentation. I think that was the basement to the high rise. We had a banker, Andrew, that came in and spoke along with us.
He was actually on the show, I think episode 6 or 7 or something like that.
Yeah.
Right.
And, so any chance I can get to speak about, the cannabis industry, the fraud and in that organization, the ACFE, it's a lot about how to teach people how to prevent fraud to begin with.
Yeah.
So you kind of hit those big areas that the cannabis industry would be a bit more susceptible, to, especially in high growth type areas.
Yeah, no, that's great. I honestly, I think this is a topic that doesn't get talked about enough. I've been to a lot of cannabis industry trade organization trade shows and conferences, and quite frankly, I never see this topic talked about.
Yeah.
Nobody mentions pump and dumps. Nobody mentions fraud. Nobody mentions misrepresentations. I think it's also a topic that can be kind of sensitive too, if you want to know the truth, right? Because I think to some level, also, there are a lot of small business owners that I think instinctively they know that they're misrepresenting the value or the scope of their business,
right?
But they'll never come out and say, "Yeah, I lied about this," or "I fudged the numbers a little bit to make it look more impressive." So I think it can be kind of an interesting and yet sensitive topic, and that's hence the reason why it doesn't get talked about enough.
Yeah, and I mean, you'll see. I mean, some of my clients in the past too. I mean, there's the black and white lies that you can't get out of, right?
Yeah.
Where I went to college. Well, that would just be a black and white lie. But when it comes down to like financials and stuff like that, it's you can kind of be gray area with when you say I've been profitable for X period of time, but it depends on how you define profit, right? And how you calculate it. And of course, if there's an indictment, which is going to happen after people start losing their money and, they're going to try to twist words and things like that. And that's kind of what we've seen. I've seen matters, where, okay, there's definitely misrepresentations, but then these other ones where, you could argue that this was not a lie, right? A misrepresentation, gray area at most, but you kind of pick and choose if you're the government on what you're going to go after them on. But yeah, it makes you worried too. If you're trying to raise capital, you have to be extra, careful, making sure you have an attorney involved when you're raising the capital.
And a CPA.
And a CPA, of course, making sure that those representations that you're making are going to be backed if, it hits the fan.
Right.
Right.
Well, hey, this was an intriguing and stimulating conversation. I appreciate you making the time to come on the Sativa segment. Any last words of advice before we go off air?
Yeah, no, I mean, it's, if you're in the cannabis industry and you're experiencing high growth, get someone like me to come in there and help you make sure that your business, your controls around the accounting processes are tight. You don't wait until you're, growing too much and realize how much money that you lost in the beginning. And
by that time, it's too late.
A lot of the time it is too late. And again, if you're, I go back to that saying, trust is the worst control. It doesn't matter how close you are with someone. Yeah. We've seen family members steal. We've seen best friends steal. And, it's get your controls over the accounting, tight so that you can try to prevent this.
Sounds good, Cliff. Well, thank you for coming on the show, and we'll be in touch soon.
Absolutely. Thanks, Richard.
Thanks.